Welcome back. The last video we dealt with the life and ministry of one of the great preachers of the Great Awakening, perhaps the greatest influence, both theologically as well as in terms of the event of the Great Awakening itself, that is Jonathan Edwards. And now we turn to the other great preacher of the Great Awakening, namely George Whitefield. So let's return again to our set of PowerPoints here and continue on and introduce George Whitefield. We've already introduced George Whitefield again in the video in the lecture on John Wesley. So again, you can see that we're talking about someone that had an influence both in England and now in the colonies or in America. While Edwards was the most prominent theologian of the time and by far the most influential and famous evangelist of the Great Awakening was George Whitefield. He was born in England, educated in Oxford, where he met and became friends with John Wesley, as we've already seen. And during his spare time in college, he visited the poor and those in prison. He was a part of that holy club that we mentioned earlier. He was converted to Christ at Oxford University, and as I said, joined with the Wesleys in this holy club, a group of students who took their Christian responsibilities very seriously, met regularly for prayer, Bible study, fellowship. Again, that's why they later become Methodists. Whitefield was ordained as a deacon in the Church of England and began preaching that new birth was necessary for salvation. Now, we wouldn't probably think of that as anything too remarkable. We would think that would be something we would expect, but while he wasn't the first one to do it, Whitefield was clearly one of those that emphasized that the objective of preaching was to see people born again, experience new birth. On June the 20th, 1736, at the age of 22, he became ordained, and God blessed him with an amazing ministry. Wherever he spoke, revival accompanied him. At the Wesley brothers' request, he joined them in Georgia to continue his ministry. We already found out that that was pretty much a failed ministry for John and Charles Wesley, and doesn't seem like Whitefield was any more successful, although really didn't try to do what they were trying to do, and so he just realized nothing was really happening, and he returned to England. But when he returned to England, he began to preach and reach thousands with his preaching. He became well known in both the colonies in Great Britain, and his preaching spread revival again wherever he went. And again, he preached for the new birth, and that's what happened in the hearts of those who heard him. Sometimes you'll see his name spelled Whitefield without the E, so Whitefield or Whitfield. Its pronunciation is Whitefield. He may have been the most well-known religious figure of the 18th century English-speaking world. Again, if Edwards was the theologian and driving force of the early part of the Great Awakening in America, it was Whitefield who sort of came and picked up the baton, so to speak, and spread it not just to America but back in England as well. And he made several trips, as we're going to see. In little less than 34 years of ministry, it's estimated that Whitefield preached 18,000 sermons. He was sometimes known to preach 6 or 7 sermons a day and was heard by as many as 10 million people. Again, he carried on an extensive preaching ministry in England, Ireland, and Wales, as well as making 14 trips to Scotland and 7 trips to the American colonies. And by the way, this was in the era when it would take a number of weeks, if not months, to cross the ocean to get back and forth for all of those trips. In order to reach the many non-churchgoers, Whitefield spoke in the open fields and the large crowds, and they all came to hear the message of salvation. Whitefield became an itinerant preacher, one of God's roundabouts, as he called himself, traveling extensively in a wide-ranging ministry. This is not on the slide here, but just to tell a story. There's one account of Whitefield preaching to coal miners. I think it was somewhere in England, who had just come up from the coal mines, and their faces were black with coal dust. But as they heard Whitefield preach, the tracks of their tears would create lines on their faces from how powerful his preaching was. Um, and that, again, was something that was unusual. And maybe that's one of the reasons why people came to hear him, because while he did preach in churches from time to time, he found that he reached more people, and people who were less likely to hear the gospel in a church, by preaching in these open air arrangements, preaching in fields or preaching in town squares or things like that. In a day when itinerant preachers were often criticized as interfering with or undermining the role of parish priests, Whitefield countered that many of the established clergy couldn't bring their people to life because they themselves were spiritually dead. That sounds very much like we saw with Gilbert Tennant in his book on the dangers of an unconverted ministry. So if the local preachers aren't doing their job of winning souls, then God's going to use somebody like George Whitefield. Whitefield not only traveled throughout Britain bringing the gospel of Christ, he also, as we said, made 7 trips to America between 1738 and 1770. Probably the most well-traveled man in the colonies. So he traveled in the Americas more than most of the Americans did, most of the colonists did. And everywhere he went, he drew large crowds. Another story that's not on the slides here but needs to be told is that when he went to Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin was one that would go to hear him. Benjamin Franklin, who was an avowed agnostic and never a man of faith, but was always loved to hear, and by his own testimony was always very moved to hear George Whitefield preach. Just an evidence of the power of the man's sermons. And of course, that power was not simply in his eloquence, which by all testimonies was extensive, very great, but it was the power of his message of the gospel that drew many and affected many. And this is again why there was this revival. A widespread revival was most clearly seen in his second journey, 1739 to 1741. Now note those dates, because this would have been following up just at the time when Edwards was talking about there was a revival in his church. So it was like the Spirit of God was really moving in a number of ways, in a number of places during this time. Widespread revival was most, I read that. As he toured the colonies, he would daily preach to large crowds in the open air, as we said, and sometimes the crowds were so large because they couldn't fit in churches. Whitefield's theology was thoroughly Calvinistic. This is a surprise to many. This was something, as we've already seen, that caused some strain between him and the Wesleys. And his preaching style was something that had never been seen before. One author writes, while most of his sermons at the time were delivered in the plain style, what does that mean? It means it's very, very different than what we saw with Edwards. Edwards would just read his sermons off a manuscript, but Whitefield's messages were almost completely extemporaneous. That is, he knew what he wanted to say in his head and never wrote the notes down, but what came out was, again, very eloquent and very rich theologically. Whitefield's sermons were more like a theatrical performance with oversized gestures, shouting, jumping. So it was something that he made a connection with people. His oratory was unmatched. It is reported that one well-known contemporary actor said that he would give 100 guineas if he could say, "Oh," like George Whitefield. Again, too bad we don't have recordings of that kind of preaching. Whitefield's evangelistic message and the zeal with which he preached it were scandalous among the more refined clergy. Again, particularly among those, like we saw with Edwards, the people who were more rationalistic in their religion than faithful to the scriptures. Of course, this kind of preaching has always been rejected by people that consider themselves too well educated or too sophisticated to accept it, but certainly not the kind of preaching that's rejected by the average person, or particularly the person that is made to see his need of Christ. Anyway, as a result, he began preaching in any other venue that would have him, as well as the open air. So this is where he kept getting invitations. Once he came to the colonies and people knew that he was here, with his notoriety, particularly with people like Benjamin Franklin writing accounts of his preaching in his publications. Benjamin Franklin was a printer and was trying to sell papers and pamphlets, and a popular preacher like that certainly could sell a lot. So, and that increased his fame, so that he just had more and more opportunities to preach everywhere he went. So that although his style was preaching was a shock to Puritan England, it attracted people from all walks of life, as we've been saying. So we're going to stop once again with that brief overview of George Whitefield and his preaching, and we're going to look at the theology of the Great Awakening and these revivals.